In April of 1917, when the United States entered the Great War, it did so with a bold and uniquely American promise. The war in Europe had been a brutal, grinding stalemate for 3 years, defined by mud, trenches, and horrific attrition. America promised to break that stalemate not just with its manpower, but with its industrial might. And the centerpiece of this promise was a grand, technological vision. The United States would build a colossal air armada, an unstoppable fleet of warplanes that would darken the skies over Europe and bring a swift, decisive end to the conflict. Congress, swept up in a wave of patriotic ambition, approved the largest single appropriation in American history up to that point. $640 million, the equivalent of over $15 billion today, to build 22,000 combat aircraft. The press hailed it as a masterstroke. The public celebrated the vision of American ingenuity leading the way to victory. There was just one problem. It was all a fantasy. The United States in 1917 did not have an aircraft industry. It had a handful of small boutique workshops producing a few dozen unarmed planes. It had no modern combat designs, no mass production facilities, and no experience in the brutal science of aerial warfare. This is the hidden story of America's billion-dollar failure. It's a tale of catastrophic incompetence, corporate greed, and political scandal that left American pilots on the Western Front without American planes to fly. It's the story of how the nation's greatest industrial promise became its most embarrassing wartime blunder, a secret kept from the American people while their sons were being sent to fight and die in foreign-built machines. The man put in charge of this monumental task was Howard Coffin, a brilliant automotive engineer and the head of the newly formed Aircraft Production Board. Coffin was a true believer in the power of American mass production. He had seen how men like Henry Ford had revolutionized the automobile industry, turning out thousands of cars from a single assembly line. He was convinced he could do the same for airplanes. His plan was simple and audacious. He would bypass the small, existing aircraft manufacturers and give the massive production contracts to the giants of the automobile industry in Detroit. After all, if they could build a complex automobile engine, surely they could build a simple airplane engine. This was his first critical mistake. An airplane engine is not a car engine. It requires far greater precision, much lighter materials, and an almost fanatical attention to detail. A car engine failure means you pull over to the side of the road. An airplane engine failure means you fall out of the sky. The Detroit automakers, masters of mass-producing heavy, cast-iron engines, were completely unprepared for the delicate, high-performance world of aviation engineering. The second problem was the planes themselves. America had no proven combat aircraft designs. The War Department sent a commission to Europe to study the latest British, French, and Italian planes to decide which ones to copy. But this created a bureaucratic nightmare. The commission was flooded with conflicting advice. The French offered one design, the British another. By the time the plans arrived back in the United States, they were often already obsolete, as aviation technology was advancing at a dizzying pace on the Western Front. Worse, the European plans used metric measurements and different engineering standards. They had to be completely redrawn and retooled for American factories, a process that took months of precious time. The most infamous example of this was the Bristol F.2B, a successful British two-seat fighter. The Americans decided to adopt it, but insisted on improving the design. They replaced the excellent Rolls-Royce engine with the new American-made Liberty engine, which was far too heavy and powerful for the light airframe. They redesigned the wings and fuselage to fit American production methods. The result of these improvements was a plane that was dangerously unstable. During its test flights, the wings had a terrifying tendency to simply shear off in a dive. After several fatal crashes and millions of dollars spent, the entire Americanized Bristol program had to be scrapped. It was a complete and total waste. While the fighter program was collapsing, the bomber program was in even worse shape. The plan was to mass-produce the British de Havilland DH.4, a light day bomber. Here again, the decision was made to Americanize it by fitting it with the powerful Liberty engine. This time, the combination worked, but the production process was a disaster. Contracts were handed out to companies with zero aircraft experience, like the Dayton Wright Company in Ohio, which was founded by automotive executives. The factory was poorly managed, the workers were untrained, and the quality control was abysmal. A scandal erupted when it was discovered that the company was using inferior spruce wood for the wing spars, and that some officers in charge of inspection were also on the company's payroll. The first American-built DH-4s that arrived in France were so poorly constructed that many were deemed unflyable by the pilots at the front. They were riddled with defects. Fuel tanks leaked, wings were improperly rigged, and engines were poorly mounted. American pilots, who had been waiting desperately for their new American-made machines, were furious and disillusioned. They began to call the DH for the flaming coffin, because its massive fuel tank was located directly between the pilot and the observer, meaning that if it was hit, it would incinerate the entire crew. By the spring of 1918, a full year after America had entered the war, the situation was a national embarrassment. The government had spent nearly $1 billion, and not a single American-built fighter or bomber had seen combat on the Western Front. The promise to darken the skies had become a bitter joke. American pilots who were flying and dying in combat were doing so in second-hand French Spads and British Sopwith Camels. The public, which had been fed a steady diet of patriotic propaganda about America's industrial might, began to suspect that something was terribly wrong. The scandal finally broke into the open thanks to a man named Gutzon Borglum. Borglum is famous today as the sculptor of Mount Rushmore, but in 1918, he was a passionate and tempestuous artist who fancied himself an aviation expert. He used his connections to get himself appointed as an official investigator for President Wilson. What he uncovered shocked him. He found evidence of widespread incompetence, bureaucratic infighting, and what he believed was massive corporate profiteering. He wrote a scathing, 100-page report to the president, accusing the leaders of the aircraft program of being traitors and claiming that the entire enterprise was controlled by a shadowy automobile trust that was deliberately sabotaging production to protect their own interests. Borglum's report was leaked to the press, and it caused a firestorm. The New York Times ran headlines like, "Crippled America's Wings." Congress launched a series of investigations. The public was outraged. They had sent their sons to war and had been promised they would be protected by the best technology in the world. Instead, they were hearing stories of faulty planes and corrupt contracts. The billion-dollar failure became a national scandal. The official investigations that followed were a mixed bag. A Justice Department inquiry, led by Charles Evans Hughes, ultimately cleared the program of deliberate treasonous sabotage. But it did uncover a damning record of inexcusable delay, waste, and incompetence. It confirmed that car manufacturers were given contracts they couldn't handle, that designs were chosen and then abandoned at enormous cost, and that the entire program was a chaotic mess with no clear leadership. So, was the entire program a failure? Not entirely. Hidden within the wreckage of the fighter and bomber programs was one astonishing, war-winning success. It was the one piece of the puzzle that the Americans got right: the engine. Realizing they couldn't efficiently copy the complex, hand-built European engines, a team of America's best engineers was assembled in a Washington, D.C. hotel room in May 1917. Their mission was to design a new engine from scratch, one that was powerful, reliable, and, most importantly, could be mass-produced using American factory methods. In an incredible, almost unbelievable feat of engineering, they designed the entire Liberty L-12 engine in just 6 days. The Liberty was a masterpiece of pragmatic design. It was a massive 12-cylinder engine that could produce over 400 horsepower, making it one of the most powerful aircraft engines in the world. But its true genius was its simplicity. It was designed with standardized, interchangeable parts just like a Ford Model T. This meant that it could be built not by specialized craftsmen, but on the assembly lines of America's great automobile companies. Ford, Lincoln, Packard, and others were given contracts, and this time the plan worked. They began churning out Liberty engines by the thousands. While America had failed to produce its own combat planes, it was now producing the best heavy aircraft engine of the war in massive quantities. The Allies in Europe were desperate for them. The British took the Liberty engine and put it in their superb de Havilland DH-9A bomber, creating one of the best light bombers of the war. The French used it. The Italians used it. The irony was profound. America's great contribution to the air war was not the finished planes it had promised, but the powerful heart that would give life to the aircraft of its allies. And the American-built DH-4s, once their initial quality control issues were sorted out, eventually did reach the front in large numbers in the final months of the war, powered by the Liberty engine. They performed well as observation and day bombing platforms. But the dream of an all-American fighter force of American aces flying American-designed pursuit planes never materialized during World War I. The story of American aircraft manufacturing in 1917 and 1918 is a classic tale of a nation's ambition colliding with its own inexperience. It is a story of a massive industrial failure, a billion-dollar blunder that left its pilots without the tools they had been promised. The promise to darken the skies was never fulfilled. By the end of the war, of the 45,000 aircraft the AEF had on hand in France, over 95% were of foreign manufacture. The great American air armada never arrived. But it is also a story of a hidden success. The Liberty engine was a triumph of American ingenuity and mass production. It was a crucial contribution to the Allied victory, a weapon that came not from the airframe designers, but from the engine specialists in Detroit. The experience, though painful and costly, also laid the foundation for the future. The companies that failed so spectacularly in 1918, Boeing, Douglas, and others, learned the hard lessons of aircraft production. In the decades that followed, they would use that knowledge to build the very industry that would, in the next Great War, truly fulfill the promise of 1917. In the Second World War, the American arsenal of democracy would produce over 300,000 aircraft, an industrial miracle that was born from the ashes of the billion-dollar failure of the first. The first attempt was a disaster, a hidden front of industrial chaos and broken promises, but it was a failure that America learned from, and ultimately, a failure that paved the way for its eventual mastery of the skies.